There is a certain kind of man who has not given up on love the way other people give up on things. Not through defeat, not through bitterness, through something quieter and more considered than either of those, through a careful private assessment of the evidence and the conclusion, arrived at without drama, that some pursuits extract more than they return, and that the intelligent response is to redirect the energy elsewhere. Daniel Calloway had made this assessment at 34. He was 38 now. He had, in the intervening 4 years, become very good at being alone. Not lonely. That is not the same thing, and he was precise about the distinction. Lonely is what you are when you want something you don't have, and the wanting becomes a noise you cannot locate the source of. Alone is what you choose when the alternative has cost you enough that you have begun to regard the cost as a data point rather than a wound. He had been engaged once. Her name was Priya. They had been together for 4 years, engaged for 11 months, and she had ended it on a Sunday in March with the gentleness of someone who had rehearsed it, which he later understood, was the kindest possible version of the things she had to do. He did not blame her. He was not built for bitterness. He had simply looked at what remained after she left and understood, with the same precision he brought to everything, that what remained was sufficient. A career that required everything he had, an apartment that suited him exactly, 3 friends who had known him long enough to require no performance. He was not unhappy. That is the first thing. He had, however, made one tactical error. He had told his friends he was fine. Friends, when told you are fine, do one of 2 things. They believe you, or they decide you are not, and that the correction is their responsibility. Daniel's 3 closest friends, Marcus, Joel, and Priya's former colleague Diane, who had inexplicably remained his friend through the dissolution of the engagement with the loyalty of someone who had simply decided that was what she was doing, had collectively decided that Daniel was not fine. That fine was the word men used when they had filed the grief somewhere efficient and forgotten to retrieve it. They were not entirely wrong. He had simply not agreed that their prescription followed from their diagnosis. The prescription was this: a blind date. He said no. They continued. He said no again, with more specificity, articulating the precise reasons why the format did not appeal to him, why the engineered nature of the encounter produced a performance dynamic that precluded the kind of honest exchange from which anything real could grow, why he was, at 38, too old for auditions. Marcus said, "It's dinner, Dan. It's just dinner." Daniel agreed to dinner. He was very clear that he was agreeing to dinner and nothing else, that this was not an endorsement of the underlying project, that he would attend, conduct himself with courtesy, and that would be the extent of his participation in whatever they believed they were setting in motion. Marcus said, "Perfect. Saturday, 7:30, the place on Clement Street. She'll be wearing something yellow. Her name is Sophia." Daniel said, "How do you know what she'll be wearing?" Marcus did not answer this question in a way that invited further questions. The restaurant on Clement Street was the kind of place that had been there long enough to have absorbed the neighborhood into its walls. Not fashionable, permanent, the tables close enough that conversation required a certain trust. He arrived at 7:22 because he was not the kind of man who was late, even to things he had not wanted to attend. He told the host he was meeting someone. He was shown to a table near the window. He sat down. He ordered water. He looked at the door. At 7:31, a woman in yellow appeared in the doorway. She was scanning the room with the particular expression of someone looking for a specific thing and not yet finding it. He registered this, registered the yellow, understood she was Sophia, and raised one hand. She saw him. Something shifted in her expression, the micro-adjustment of someone recalibrating an expectation. She crossed the room. She said, "Hi." "Are you?" She paused. She said a name. The name was not Daniel. He said, "No, I'm Daniel." She said, "Oh." Then she sat down anyway, with the pragmatic composure of a woman who had encountered an unexpected situation and decided, without visible deliberation, that she could either stand at a table in a restaurant renegotiating her position, or she could sit down and determine what the situation actually was. She sat down. Her name was not Sophia. Her name was Elena Vasquez. She was 35. She had also, it emerged in the first 4 minutes of a conversation neither of them had planned to be having, been sent to this restaurant by friends who had told her the man she was meeting would be wearing a gray jacket and would be sitting near the window. He was wearing a gray jacket. He was sitting near the window. They had each been set up by entirely different people for entirely different blind dates at the same restaurant on the same evening. And something in the coordination of this, the specific, improbable geometry of it, produced in both of them, independently and simultaneously, the first genuine laugh either of them had managed in the context of a first meeting in longer than either would immediately admit. She said, "So where is your Sophia?" He said, "I have no idea. I assume she's somewhere in this city," equally confused. She said, "And your friends think you need to be here because," he said, "they've decided I'm fine in a way they find unconvincing." She looked at him. She was a teacher. She had spent 11 years in a classroom reading the difference between what children said and what they meant, and the skill had not remained in the classroom. She said, "And are you?" He said, "At this particular moment, less so than usual." She almost smiled. He clocked it. He said, "Your friends think the same about you." She said, "My friends are not wrong. They're just," she paused. She chose her words with the care of a person who had learned that imprecise language produces imprecise outcomes. She said, "They're solving for the wrong thing." He said, "What's the right thing?" She said, "I don't know yet. That's why they're solving for the wrong one." The waiter came. They ordered not because either of them had planned to stay, but because neither of them had decided to leave, and the waiter's arrival created a decision point, and the decision, made independently and simultaneously, was to stay. Elena taught secondary school. Literature and history, the two subjects that had seemed, when she chose them at 22, like the most honest available response to the question of what mattered. She had been teaching for 11 years. She still, she said, felt the particular sensation on the first day of every academic year of something opening. Not nervousness, possibility. She said this with the specificity of someone reporting an observed fact, not performing enthusiasm. He said, "What do you teach them about?" She said, "How to read what isn't said, how to find the argument underneath the argument, how to sit with something complicated long enough that it starts to yield." She paused. She said, "Most of them arrive thinking literature is about plot. It takes about a year to show them it's about attention." He said, "Attention to what?" She said, "To the thing the writer was trying to say that they couldn't say directly, the thing that only exists in the space between the sentences." He was quiet for a moment. He said, "I work in architecture. I have spent 15 years telling people that the most important part of a building is the space you don't fill." She said, "Yes, exactly that." Two people discovering, across a table they had not planned to share, that they had each, by entirely different paths and entirely different vocabularies, arrived at the same understanding of where meaning lives. Not in the stated thing, in the gap around it. He told her about Priya, not the version he told people, the version underneath, the one that acknowledged that what had ended was not simply a relationship, but a model of the future he had been inhabiting for 4 years, and that when it ended he had not known how to grieve something as abstract as a model, so he had not. He had packed it efficiently and redirected and called himself fine, and largely believed it. She listened in the way she had described listening to her students, not waiting for the pause to fill, just present. When he finished, she said, "The thing you've been treating as a conclusion is actually a question you haven't answered yet." He said, "What question?" She said, "Whether you stop believing in the relationship or in the possibility of being known." He said nothing for long enough that the question settled into the air between them and became something neither of them needed to disturb. Then he said, "That's the question, isn't it?" She said, "It usually is." She told him about her own architecture of aloneness, constructed not after one event, but after a series of smaller ones. The quiet accumulation of moments in which she had understood herself more clearly than the person across from her had, which had produced, not through decision, but through attrition, a habit of self-sufficiency that had gradually become indistinguishable from preference. She said, "I know my students better than I know most of the adults in my life. I know exactly what they need, exactly how to reach them, exactly which sentence will land and which won't. I am very good at understanding people. She said, the difficulty is that understanding someone is not the same as letting them understand you. I have been on the wrong side of that distinction for a long time. He said, how long? She said, since before I noticed I was doing it. That's the way it usually goes. The restaurant had thinned around them. They had been there 2 hours and 40 minutes. Neither of them had checked the time. The waiter, with the professional sensitivity of someone who read tables for a living, had stopped offering the dessert menu. She said, what do you think happened to Sophia? He said, I think she's probably at a table on the other side of this restaurant with a man named, what was the name your friends gave you? She said, Thomas. He said, with a man named Thomas having a perfectly acceptable evening. She said, and we're having this one. He said, yes. She said, which neither of us planned. He said, no. She said, I have a theory about unplanned things. He said, tell me. She said, the planned ones go the way you design them, which means they can only be as good as your design. The unplanned ones have no ceiling. He looked at her across the table they had not planned to share, in the restaurant they had both arrived at looking for someone else, and felt the specific vertiginous sensation of a man who has closed a door and is standing in front of it, watching it open of its own accord, not being pushed, not being forced, simply gradually opening. He was not ready. He knew this. He said it. He said, I should tell you that I am not currently a reliable investment. She said, I'm a teacher. I specialize in things that aren't finished yet. He almost laughed. The laugh arrived before he could decide about it. She registered this with the expression of someone filing evidence. Outside, the street was doing what streets do on a Saturday evening. Inhabited, lit, indifferent to the specific things happening inside the buildings it ran past. He said, can I walk you somewhere? She said, I live 8 blocks north. He said, 8 blocks is a reasonable distance for an unplanned evening. She said, it is. They walked. The city moved around them. She did not take his arm. He did not reach for her hand. There was a space between them that was not distance, but something more deliberate. The space of two people who understood, without discussion, that what was between them was already something that did not need to be closed too quickly. At her building, she turned and said, your friends are going to want to know how it went. He said, my friend sent me to meet someone named Sophia. She said, and you met someone named Elena. He said, yes. She said, what are you going to tell them? He said, that it was just dinner. She said, and was it? He said, no, but that's not for them. She looked at him for a moment with the full attention she brought to things that mattered. Then she said, same time next week, different restaurant, no yellow, no gray jacket, just two people who are done pretending this was an accident. He said, it was an accident. She said, the beginning was, the rest is a choice. She went inside. He stood on the pavement for a moment in the specific silence of a man who has just been told something true and is allowing it to settle. The city continued. The lights did what lights do. He turned and began walking home, 8 blocks south, through a Saturday evening that had not gone the way he had planned and had gone, instead, somewhere he had not known he was still capable of arriving. He was not cured. That is not what happened. He did not walk home a different man. He walked home a man with a question that was no longer abstract, a question that had, for the first time in 4 years, a face attached to it, a voice, an argument he had not won, a woman who had said the rest is a choice and meant it with the precision of someone who did not say things carelessly. He thought about what she had said about the space between the sentences, about the thing the writer was trying to say that they couldn't say directly, about how meaning lives not in the stated thing, but in the gap around it. He thought about the gap. He had spent 4 years filling it with work and competence and the clean, manageable satisfaction of a life designed to require nothing it couldn't provide for itself. He thought about what it would mean to leave the gap empty again, to let something grow in it that he had not planned, that he had not designed, that could not be calibrated in advance and could not be protected against in any way that did not also protect against the thing itself. He thought about ceilings, about plans that can only be as good as their design, about evenings with no ceiling. He got home. He put his keys on the table. He sat down in the quiet of his apartment, which was the same apartment it had been at 7 o'clock that evening, and he sat there for a while in the silence of a man who has not changed his mind, but has discovered with some surprise that his mind may not have been the final word on the matter. He texted Marcus at 11:14 p.m. The text said, "It wasn't Sophia." Marcus replied in 40 seconds. The reply said, "I know." Daniel stared at this for a long moment. Then he put his phone face down. He did not need to respond. He understood exactly what it meant, and he understood that Marcus had understood, and that the understanding did not need to be elaborated. On Thursday, 5 days later, he met Elena at a restaurant on the other side of the city. No yellow, no gray jacket, just two people at a table, choosing. She was already there when he arrived. She had a book open on the table, not performing reading, actually reading, with the attention of someone who does it because it is how she thinks. She looked up when he came through the door with the expression of someone who had wondered, in the intervening 5 days, whether the person who had walked her home on Saturday was the same person who would walk through this door on Thursday. He was. She closed the book. He sat down. He said, "The question you asked me on Saturday." She said, "Which one?" He said, "Whether I stopped believing in the relationship or in the possibility of being known." She waited. He said, "I've been thinking about it for 5 days." She said, "And?" He said, "I think I stopped believing in my ability to be known accurately. Not in the possibility, in myself as someone knowable. I think I concluded, without examining it, that Priya leaving meant I had been misread for 4 years. And if someone who knew me that well had misread me, the reasonable inference was that I was not readable, that the thing I thought I was presenting was not what was landing. So I stopped presenting." He said, "I told myself it was efficiency, was something else." Elena was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "My students, when they first encounter a difficult text, often decide the problem is the text, that it's obscure, opaque, not worth the effort. It takes time to help them understand that the difficulty is not obstruction, it's invitation. The text is asking them to slow down and pay a different kind of attention." She said, "You are not an obscure text. You are a text that has been waiting for a reader who doesn't need you to be easier than you are." He looked at her across the table with the expression of a man receiving something he had not known he needed and had not thought to ask for. Something that had no name in the vocabulary he had built for himself over 4 years of deliberate self-sufficiency. He said, "That's an extraordinary thing to say to someone you've known for 5 days." She said, "I told you, I specialize in things that aren't finished yet." What followed was not a courtship either of them would have rushed. It was a conversation extended over weeks that moved the way good conversations move, from the surface inward, not because either of them pushed it, but because they were both finally with someone who made the interior feel safe to inhabit. He went to her classroom one evening after the students had left. She was rearranging the bookshelves, which she did at the end of every term, because the order in which the books sat mattered to her, told a story about how one thing led to another, and the story needed updating as her thinking changed. He watched her work. He did not offer to help. He understood, without being told, that this was something she did alone. The quiet, private thinking through that looked like tidying and was actually something else. After a while, she said, without turning around, "You're very comfortable with silence." He said, "I've had a lot of practice." She said, "Most people feel it." He said, "Most people are afraid of what's in it." She turned then and looked at him across the ordered rows of her classroom, this man who had arrived at a table looking for someone else and had stayed, who had told her the true version of his story on the first evening and had not apologized for it, who was sitting in her classroom at 7 in the evening, watching her rearrange books with the patience of someone who understood that what he was watching was important. She said, "I've been afraid of it too." He said, "I know." She said, "How?" He said, "Because you're better at being in it when you're not alone in it. When there's someone else there, You settle. She held this. Then, you notice that. He said, I notice you, not a declaration, a statement of fact, said in the tone of a man reporting an observed condition, as though noticing her were simply something that was true of him now, had been true since a Saturday in September, and was not subject to revision. She put the last book on the shelf. She stood there for a moment with her back to him. Then she turned and crossed the room and sat in the chair beside his, and they sat in the classroom in the evening quiet, side by side in the particular silence of two people who have arrived at different speeds and from different directions, at the same place. He said after a while, I told Marcus it was just dinner. She said, what would you tell him now? He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, that it was the evening I stopped being fine and started being something that doesn't have a name yet, but is considerably better. She said, that's a very long text message. He said, he'll manage. She put her hand on the armrest between them. Open, offered, not a gesture of conclusion, an invitation. He put his hand over hers. The classroom held the silence of rooms that have absorbed years of attention and given them back. I want to return to the restaurant for a moment, to the specific instant when she sat down. She did not know him. He was not who she had come to meet. The situation had presented her with an exit. Easy, face-saving, entirely reasonable. She could have said wrong table, smiled, and walked across the room to look for Thomas. She sat down. I think about this decision often. Not because it was romantic, because it was honest. She had looked at the situation and understood that the default exit was available and that taking it was not the same as the right choice. She had assessed what was in front of her, a man in a gray jacket who was not who she was looking for, and she had decided that not who she was looking for was not the same as not worth staying for. We are very good at taking the exit. We have refined the exit to an art form. We have given it names, not the right time, not what I was expecting, not ready. These are all true things. The exit is not dishonest. It is simply, sometimes, a way of optimizing for the known quantity at the expense of the thing we cannot yet categorize. Elena sat down because she could not, with integrity, leave before she understood what she was leaving. That is all. That was everything. Daniel, for his part, had gone to that restaurant as a man fulfilling an obligation. He had planned to be courteous, adequate, and done. He had not planned to tell the truth. He had not planned to be met in the middle of telling it by someone who received it without flinching and gave him something equally true in return. He had not planned to leave and spend 5 days with a question that had a face. There is a thing that happens sometimes when you have built yourself a life that works, a life that is quiet and sufficient and requires nothing that cannot be provided for, when something arrives that your architecture has no category for. The architecture does not fail. It simply reveals in the arrival of the thing it cannot accommodate, what it was never designed to hold. Daniel had built something excellent. He had not built it for Elena. He had not known to. She had not known to build anything for him either. She had arrived at 35 with her books and her classroom and her students and her friends who thought they were solving for the right thing. And she had sat down across from a wrong man and discovered, over 2 hours and 40 minutes, that wrong was doing a lot of work in that sentence. The strangeness of it, two people sent to the same table for the same evening by entirely different people who knew them well enough to know they were lonely and not well enough to know what for, is not something either of them would call fate. They were both too precise for that word. What they would call it is this: the right conditions. The right conditions for two people who had learned, through different methods and different costs, that being understood accurately was a rarer thing than being loved, who had both, without consultation, arrived at the same private conviction that they would rather be alone and known than accompanied and misread. They had not been looking for each other. They had not been looking for anyone. That is the sentence I want to leave you with. Not because it is a comfort, because it is a fact that matters. You do not have to be looking. You have to be present. Present enough to sit down when the situation does not match the plan. Present enough to say the true version of the story. Present enough to ask the real question and wait, without flinching, for the real answer. The rest is not fate. The rest is a choice. Elena told him later, much later, on an evening in January when they were in his apartment and she was reading, and he was doing what he often did in the evenings now. The quiet, contented work of a man who is in the same room as someone he is glad to be in the same room as, that she had almost not worn yellow. She said, I had the dress on and I thought, this is too much, too deliberate, too much like trying. He said, what made you keep it on? She said, I thought, if I'm going to do this at all, I should do it honestly. The yellow was honest, so I kept it. He put down what he was working on. He looked at her across the room. He said, I'm glad you kept it on. She said, I know. I could tell from the look on your face when I walked in. He said, what look? She said, the look of a man who had decided not to be surprised by anything, and then was. He held this. He said, that's exactly right. She went back to her book. He went back to his work. The apartment held the quiet of two people who had arrived by accident and stayed by choice and were now, in the unremarkable way of all the best things, simply home. If this story resonates with you, please like it, share it, and subscribe. Thank you for watching.